We'll see. We'll see what happens with it. It's kind of having a resurgence. Yeah. Yeah, I do. I mean, you know, I think it kind of flipped and then kind of went away for a while, and I think it's kind of, we're getting interested again. Exactly. Exactly.
Just a reminder to everybody, please
to get the what?
Hands to go up.
Oh, yeah.
This place is huge.
Yes.
You should have Dr. Clinicals on your table.
Thank you.
If you haven't already done that. And then Dr. McAvoy is up next, and you should have the evaluations out for her as well. When those are filled out, you can pass them to the middle, or you can turn them into the basket at the registration table on your way out. But we really do appreciate that feedback, and it's super important to us. So thank you. Next, we're going to welcome Dr. Karen McAvoy to deliver our keynote presentation. She is a licensed clinical psychologist and the director of the Center for Concussion at the Rocky Mountain Youth Sports Medicine Institute. Dr. McAvoy graduated with a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Denver and went on to complete a pediatric psychology internship at the Children's Hospital in Denver and an adult pediatric behavioral medicine postdoctorate fellowship at Farron Memorial Hospital in Massachusetts. She has more than 20 years of experience both as a clinical psychologist and as a school psychologist. Most recently, Dr. McAvoy has been the coordinator of mental health services and brain injury services for Cherry Creek School District. From 2004 to 2007, Dr. McAvoy was the clinical manager on a Centers for Disease Control study of concussion in high school athletes. As a result of that study, Dr. McAvoy authored REAP, a community-based concussion management program for families, schools, and medical professionals. Good to see all of you kind of people in the room today. In partnership with Health One emergency departments, REAP provides communities with an immediate and comprehensive concussion management protocol. When not running after her daughter, her dog, and her cat, Dr. McAvoy is an avid runner and consumer of fiction. So if you have a chance between sessions, ask her what she's been reading. So with no further ado, we'll welcome Dr. Karen McAvoy to talk about a collaborative concussion culture.
Well, thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa and Iowa Concussion Consortium for having me out here for this conference. And it's extra special with your proclamation that just happened this week with the Department of Public Health and Department of Education. What incredible things you are doing here. So I am pleased to be here. I have actually been to Iowa a couple of other times before. As some of you guys might have seen those, so I'm trying to do a little bit of a different talk so there isn't a repeat. But I've been to Iowa in other times of the month, different months of the year, and we were really negotiating hard for an August conference because we've heard about your state fair. And so the planners of this committee have promised me an abundance of animals, tractors, and any food imaginable on a stick. So when we're not talking concussion, we will be at the state fair. That's where we're going later tonight. So we are thrilled to be here to talk about the REAP protocol because Iowa has really embraced this protocol, and I'm thrilled to see it develop over time. For those of you that have seen me before in the past, when I've come to talk, you know that my background is a clinical psychologist, school psychologist, and that I happened to be the psychologist at Grandview High School when Colorado had its first case of second impact syndrome. So if you recall from the talk earlier, second impact syndrome is the phenomenon where you have one injury, a concussion, that is still symptomatic, and before it is totally resolved, you take another hit to the head, and that chemical cascade of events that happens with the first concussion just is unable to take the second hit, and then there is sometimes permanent brain damage and death. In the state of Colorado, we had a young football player named Jake Snakenberg, who in the fall of 2004 was playing football in a Saturday game, freshman football game. He had taken a hit the week before, didn't realize really that he had been concussed because in 2004 we didn't really know much about concussion at that point. and he had been approved to go back and play on Saturday morning, took a second hit, not a big hit. He collapsed on the field and it was airlifted off, and he never regained consciousness. He passed away. So in our state, we actually had a death from second impact syndrome. Other states across the United States had cases of permanent brain damage, the Zachary-Lystead law in Washington State, Oregon, it's the Max's law, that kind of thing. In the state of Colorado, it's the Jake Snakenberg law. His family is actually from Iowa. His mom is from, is it Grinnell? It's close by here? Yeah, so they have Iowa connections here. So that's how I got involved in concussion. Happened to be the psychologist at this high school, happened to be doing a study for the Center for Disease Control, and we had just done impact testing with our first group of freshman football players, and Jake was in that group when we had this tragedy. So that propelled us forward, and as a result of kind of dealing with the aftermath of that, in 2009 I wrote REAP. Because we realized at that point we needed to have multiple eyes on these students. We had at that point, of course, athletic trainers and some doctors kind of involved, but we did not have the educators involved. We did not really have widespread education to the community. So in 2009, I wrote REAP, which stands for those steps that we need to be well aware of with concussion management: remove from play, reduce, educate about the symptoms, adjust and accommodate their needs over a number of weeks, and then eventually pace them back through graduated return to play. And so in 2010, Rocky Mountain Hospital for Children, is a brand new hospital in Colorado, opened its doors, approached me and asked me to come and direct their Center for Concussion. So since 2010, I have been directing the Center for Concussion. We have made REAP available online here. You can download it, the Colorado version. But you don't need to, because Iowa is actually one of the 10 states that has decided to customize REAP for your own state. You have your own story in there, you have your own resources in there, you have your own law in there. And the idea really, when I wrote REAP, was because at that point I did not believe or know that there were going to be specialty clinics for concussion. Who would have thought that at that point? The reason I wrote REAP was because there are so many rural areas. There are so many areas where if we simply even just educate a community, even if it only has one school and one doctor and some parents, we'd be able to keep our eyes better on these kids and keep them a little bit safer. So we wrote REAP, and then we were able to, as I said, it's now been able to be customized for other states. If you're not familiar with REAP, a lot of the other trainings I've done in the past go into more detail with that. Let me just kind of briefly go over what these steps stand for. And as I said, it comes out of Rocky Mountain Hospital for Children. This is where I work now, although I am still a consultant at the Department of Education in Colorado. So we use some of these same guidelines with our schools in Colorado as well. The idea about REAP was that we need to have multiple perspectives on a concussion. As you heard earlier in the talk earlier, you can't just have one discipline overseeing concussion. We might miss something that's very important. And so in 2009, when I wrote REAP, we identified that there needed to be 4 important teams. We all at that point had really good buy-in from our athletic partners, our athletic trainers who were working in the schools. They were really kind of forefront in wanting to get as much input and training and do as much of the heavy lifting with concussion. But what we did not have at that point were the educators. So we made the school team blue, but we have a light blue, which is the physical team, and a dark blue, which is the academic team. Having been the school psychologist in a school, what we realized is that we need to be helping these kids because it will impact their cognitive abilities for a number of weeks. And so that component we immediately did in from 2004 to 2007, which at that time was a very new concept. That has not really kind of risen to mainstream until recently. So we have 2 teams from the school. They're blue, light blue, dark blue. The medical team has been somewhat involved, but primarily in the beginning they were involved in those tragic cases, the ones that We missed, they were hit again, we had brain damage, we had death, and then the medical providers and personnel have started to get more involved in terms of recognition, the treatment for the rehab, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that team has always been there, but the legislation then made medical providers essential in terms of clearance of the concussion return to play. And of course the family team has always been there, but if you have Googled anything on concussion lately, have you? The information is massive, right? There is so much information out there. It's a little hard for our families to know which parts. There are a lot of myths out there, right? Never let your kids sleep, right? So, we have kids that we see in the clinic where they can't get in to see us for 3 days. The concussion happens on a Friday, they come to see us on a Monday, and the parents bring this child in. They're so proud of the fact they didn't let this kid sleep all weekend. Well, nobody slept all weekend, right? And the whole family now looks a bit concussed because everybody's like sleep, deprived. So there are all these little kernels of truth in the information out there, but it's how we put it together now. So hopefully you belong to one or a couple of these teams in here. How many educators do we have in the room? Okay, just a few. How many athletic trainers, sports coaches do we have in the room? Okay, so kind of the light blue part. How many of you are healthcare providers? MDs, nurses, excellent. PTs, OTs, all of that would fall into that. And how many of you are parents? So there might be multiple parts of this that you'll hear as we go through the training of REAP that you'll say, well, this is my parent hat. This is what I need to know. And that's why when we wrote REAP, we color-coded it. We made everybody understand that while you need to know that there are other teams involved and you need to know what those other teams are responsible for, if you're looking at this from the parent perspective, this is what I need to know. Need to have my kid rest for a little bit, miss a couple days of school, that kind of thing. For a coach, it's other kinds of training. But the point of having these 4 teams is that we knew that we needed to have input from all of them. We knew that we needed to not miss the important pieces of information that each team was getting. The hard part about concussion management is how do you now get all those teams to work together? And in large settings, in large school districts, in communities, this is a big challenge. But that is what we missed with Jake. That is when we went back and looked at what had happened, we had information on Jake that perhaps had we put all of our heads together, we would have recognized it as a concussion and he would not have been able to go back out to play. But we didn't know that at the time. And that's what we're trying to prevent. So it's an immediate, we want this information to be out to your communities as quickly as possible. Yes, we have fine-tuned this in specialty clinics, but there are rural areas across all of our states where simply having a book where someone can go to and say, this is what I need to do, would be helpful and could perhaps prevent the concern with second impact syndrome. So that's where this collaborative approach has come in. And so what Jeff really wanted me to talk about today is how has that now moved forward now that it is roughly 16 years into this concussion management initiative. So let me just really quickly hit the REAP in case this is something that is new to you. The R stands for remove and reduce. The first version of REAP did not have both remove and reduce. We needed to add that in the second version. The remove stands specifically for any physical activity, no physical play, no PE, no recreational play. It is just always safer if that is a black and white decision and that is a no until medical clearance. But what to do at home, what to do at school, those are not black and white decisions. You cannot say to a kid, you cannot text from now until clearance, maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks down the road. You will have a very unhappy teenager and they will make your life miserable. So in terms of what to do at home, we need to talk about shades of gray. Can you limit the texting? Can you cut it down in the beginning of the concussion? Can you cut down TV? Can you cut down computer use? Can you cut down technology? no video games in the beginning, but eventually it's okay to add that back in again, especially with the new information about a progressive, gradual return to some of these activities. So with home stimulation, cut it down and slightly and then add it back in again. The same thing with school. Can we cut down some of the demands in the beginning once they go back to school? Can we cut down test taking, maybe cut back reading? But it's not reasonable or realistic to send a child back to school and say, you will not read for 3 to 4 weeks. If you're an educator, you know, then the educators will say, but what am I going to do with this kid? And now with the use of computers in schools, that's something we also have to kind of just say, do it in smaller increments, shades of gray, do a little bit, just so the symptoms begin to bump up a little bit and bring it back down again. So the concept of having the symptoms tell the story of how much we can kind of push the brain and how far to go with it becomes an important part of the management of a concussion. And so the one black and white non-negotiables, no PE, no physical play, no possible hits to the head again. The others in terms of reducing are grades, shades of gray, pull them back and start to add them back in slowly. The E stands for educate, and I intended that to mean that the symptoms were going to tell us the story of recovery. With the students that you're working with, you know that their symptoms are heightened at the beginning of a concussion. They might not be able to tolerate being in a room with the lights on the first day or two. They couldn't look at a book. They don't even want to watch TV. They might not be texting because it's too hard on their eyes. But within a couple of days or a week, they're able to do that. And that tells you when you're exerting the brain and the cells are delivering enough fuel to the brain, then you are able to manage more. It tells us we're getting recovery. So the symptoms tell the story, and we're always educating our families, our healthcare providers, our school people, that being able to learn to read those symptoms tells you how much we're getting with recovery. The analogy I always use with my kids when I'm working with them in the clinic is, I know that there's a whole pathophysiology about the cells, but I tend not to go into detail with my kids on that because I don't want to scare them. What I say to the kids is, this is not a bruise, this is not a bleed, this is a short-term inefficiency of the cells in your brain. And so right now when you have a concussion, you're a little bit like an iPhone 4 instead of an iPhone 7. You're not broken. But if you're one of those people that has an iPhone 4, you just know that you're going to have to take your charger with you because you might not make it through the day. The other analogy I use with my kids is, you are like a car with a small gas tank. You are not broken, you do not need to stay in the garage, but you are not a race car. And actually what you need to do, because recovery takes 1 to 4 weeks now, so the newest research on concussion recovery for the child and teenage years is 70% of kids will have resolution of a concussion in 1 to 28 days. So that's 1 month. That means that our kids are somewhat compromised for up to 1 month, but not broken. We don't want them in the garage, in a dark room for a month. We would cause all kinds of other spin-out problems. We would have depression, we would have social isolation, we would get too far behind in school, but we don't want them going at the pace that they normally go, which is 200 miles an hour. So we work with our kids on, you are a car with a small gas tank, you can tootle around town, but you need to know where the gas stations are. You're going to do, then fill, then do, then fill, then do, then fill. And the filling part of concussion management is simply resting your eyes for 5 or 10 minutes, taking your eyes off the book for 5 or 10 minutes, going to the nurse's office for 20 minutes, mid-morning, mid-afternoon. So we just build in these little breaks to refuel. That's what tends to keep our kids going for 1 to 4 weeks. Because 4 weeks is a long time for kids with a concussion. So being able to recognize and manage your symptoms becomes key in being able to keep your life going. Maybe your concussion happens 2 weeks out from prom. Are you going to go to prom? When will you ever get a chance to go to prom again? Can you go to prom if you manage it slightly differently? It's a couple weeks from finals. Can you handle finishing the semester? So all of those are questions that Every kid with a concussion has a different outcome. So we don't say things like you absolutely can't, because maybe you're going to have a good enough recovery to be able to go to prom or finish finals. But some kids can't. And that's that individualized part of it. So we educate everyone about what the symptoms are telling us and about recovery. But the good news about every concussion, this is the A, which stands for adjust and accommodate, is that almost all kids get better from a concussion in a certain amount of time if we are cognizant and mindful of the recovery. So for the home and the school pieces, we cut back in the beginning, and over 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, we slowly add back in, always being aware of what that symptom threshold is. And not necessarily panicking about those symptoms, but just saying, okay, maybe overdid it a little bit today, gonna bring it down a little bit tomorrow, and then keep on moving forward. So 2 steps forward, 1 back, kind of a rehab model. The one thing that we don't do, at least at this point, is to add in a lot of physical, except in a rehab setting, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But in terms of what to do at home and what to do at school, you know, we do say, go ahead and go with shades of gray and start to slowly move them forward. You don't need medical clearance for that. You need understanding of the symptoms. And it's safer to test out recovery in these 2 ways than it is to put them back on the field, where we risk one mistake and having second impact syndrome. So, you know, while you might get a headache with an algebra test, it generally doesn't have, you know, catastrophic, you know, outcomes. If we overdid it with an algebra test, then we'll just cut it back and we'll, you know, move a little bit slower. So it's that concept of moving you forward, adjust and accommodate over a number of weeks. And then eventually you get to the pace part. And this is the part that most of our our kids who want to go back to sports care about, is when can I clear and go back to my sport? And the top part there says basically you need to have consensus with data from all 4 of your teams to make sure that everything is in place before you start the graduated return to play steps. And so return to learn happens before return to play, and that's primarily because if you are having cognitive symptoms from a concussion that you didn't have, so if you can't remember, you can't think, you can't take tests, you're still having headaches, of course. If you're having any symptoms at all, including cognitive, before you start your graduated return to play, then you're technically not symptom-free and back to baseline in all areas. And that's why we wait for return to learn, make sure you're 100% able to do all your academics, and then that makes you symptom-free. If everything else is okay with your neurocognitive testing at home, all those other things, and then you start your graduated return to play steps. And that's the progressive return to play that the international guidelines have always talked about. So this is just the basics of REAP. It was developed to really be able to manage and manage. I say manage instead of treatment, because treatment is what we do when we have kids that are outliers, that are longer than that 28 days, that are having more complications, and we need to do rehab, which I'll jump into in a minute. But there's a good chunk of kids that are going to get better with just these 4 steps over 28 days if we just are mindful and are working with these 4 teams. And that is our hope, is that we are preventing problems down the road because we have quick and flexible and fluid interventions right off the bat with these 4 steps for the first month. And we hope that's maybe about 70% of our kids or so, right? And so obviously with this protocol, it requires a lot of communication, it requires a lot of collaboration, and passing the baton back and forth between the teams, knowing that we're all reliant upon each other's data, each other's input before we move forward. And that's why every single person on every single team is important in the concussion management protocol. Okay? So having said that, this has kind of been around for a number of years, and I've been out to your state to talk about some of the more details of this, and can come out and do more trainings with you as we go forward. But what the planners of this conference really asked me to talk about today is, so what does all of this mean in the context of the new Berlin guidelines, which just came out at the end of 2016. What does all this mean now, basically 16, 17 years into concussion management protocol? The first international meeting was in Vienna in 2001. It's now 2017. So what have we learned, and how has our treatment and management changed over time? So I'm going to go a little bit more into the REAP protocol as it relates to the Berlin guidelines, because those are the newest guidelines. They incorporate the newest evidence, and all of that is being written into the updated version of REAP, which Iowa has also decided to continue to get this new version. And in fact, Jeff Lauer from the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa is helping me to write the foreword about how well a state can use this protocol to help move this across your whole state. So he's helping with all of that. So we will have the updated version of REAP for you, we hope, before too long, and it's going to incorporate the new evidence from the Berlin guidelines. So let me give you a sneak peek on that, okay? So REAP in Iowa is basically your roadmap to having these 4 teams working together to be taking care of all of our kids across the state. It's less of an actual program per se, as it is kind of a mindset. REAP is kind of your organized thinking, how to get your 4 teams to work together, and when and how do they pass the baton back and forth to each other. And so it becomes, and there's going to be some differences in different communities based upon who you have available in different places and different communities. But with the leadership that you have here, with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa, with your Iowa Consortium, they are doing great things, especially with public health and Department of Education. Now you're able to get it across your entire state. When we started REAP, it was really about sports. At this point, the statistics say that about 45% of the kids who are sustaining a concussion are not sustaining them in sports-related activities. So that means that we can't just rely on return to play legislation, which is all about our athletes. We have to have everyone in our state understand how to take care of concussions, because we're getting them from motor vehicle accidents, assaults, falls off the playground equipment, not things that are covered by your return to play legislation. Okay? So how do we widen this across your entire state? And what has really happened over the years is that each discipline has become more fine-tuned in its particular part of concussion management. So it's very discipline independent. If I were to go talk to a group of physical therapists, there's specific things that they need in terms of their training that speak their language. When I speak to educators, I speak a very specific kind of language to educators. So every discipline has now taken this concussion management and really done an incredible job in each one of those areas. So it's discipline independent, but it's team interdependent. So it's, the way I always think of this is if you think of languages, so the one language I know that has this, is very complicated, is Chinese. I looked it up this morning. There are about 20 different dialects of Chinese. And if you speak Cantonese, you might not be able to speak to someone over here in Fukienese. But there's a national language called Mandarin. So the educators speak a language, the PTs speak a language, the medical providers speak a language, and when you do the trainings for each one of them, you need to go in depth so that it really is relevant to them. But when we come together to talk about one particular student, we need to speak Mandarin. We need to speak one language that helps everyone know what that means in terms of the recovery of this child. So while, yes, they're all distinct different groups, they actually, at some point, all merge together because we are sharing data and information so that we know when it's safe to move this child forward. So as I'm looking over the new Berlin guidelines and thinking to myself, wow, look how things have changed over 16 years. And I'm thinking, we have really now widened. When we look at concussion, we talk about memory issues, we talk about emotional issues, we talk about behavioral issues, we talk about vertigo, we talk about headaches, we talk about migraines. And I'm thinking, you know, we really have come a long way in all these years. And I found this quote that I thought, wow, this is probably related to the Berlin guidelines and how much richer our guidance is now after all these years. So I looked at this and I thought, doesn't that kind of sum up what we know about concussion at this point? And then I looked at the reference. This was written in 1911. This is what they were describing about brain injury, might have been a concussion, back in 1911. So they had all the pieces then. It's just kind of taken us a while to figure out what that all means and to put them into each one of our disciplines. So let's go into the new Berlin guidelines and see how that is connected to REAP, what that does to REAP. So the consensus guidelines come out every 4 years. The newest ones were from Berlin in 2016. And the big differences I've kind of highlighted here. Of course, they still say that with a concussion, you must remove them from any potential future hit to the head because of second impact syndrome. That hasn't changed, so removal is the first thing. But rest has been a big question. We used to put them in a dark room, if you remember those days, cocooning them. That didn't seem to do much for the kids, actually. Might have made them worse. And before that, we didn't do anything at all. We didn't recognize it, and we didn't stop their activities at all. So now we're going with a kind of in-between. There's insufficient evidence to say that we need significantly long periods of rest. But what we do need is that we need some period of rest followed by gradual and progressive activity back to their cognitive and physical. And that's primarily what we mean by that is cardio, not back to play, not back to sport, but some amount of aerobic activity. And up to a certain point of threshold. So again, using the symptoms to tell us what's the right amount. All right, so this is kind of the new area of research that's come out of concussion. And of course, that's going to impact in the REAP protocol, both the medical health providers, what they're advising in terms of cardio activity, and the school physical team, the athletic trainer at the school. What does this mean in terms of cardio? Does this mean at school? Does this mean at home? At this point in our clinic, at the Center for Concussion, we are keeping cardio activity to being a home program supervised by parents or done in rehab, PT, OT, not done at school, because in my experience with schools, it's easier for schools to be black and white thinkers. You're out of PE, you're out of physical play, you're out of physical play at recess, and there's no shades of gray because that's when dangerous things happen. So some cardio, but generally this is still seen as a rehab model at home. Rehabilitation is the buzzword with concussion over and over and over. And so now rehabilitation is in the Berlin guidelines, which is great because this really is what's making our kids better. I remember when we started the Center for Concussion in 2010 and we saw kids with concussion, we said, in about 3 weeks, come back and see us. Hopefully you'll feel better. And we just crossed our fingers. That's not much treatment. That's very unsatisfying as a clinician to not be able to provide more. Now we talk about, why don't we refer you to physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, because of the vestibular issues, the ocular motor issues, all of those things that we're finding, the autonomic instability. We can fix those things in therapy now. So rehab is now a very promising new kind of treatment for these kids. The data, as I said, is now changing. For children, we would expect the typical recovery now to be up to 28 days. That's a big significant change from what it was earlier. It used to be 3 to 4 days you'd see, 7 to 10 days. You'd have our kids, they would go out with a concussion, and they would be very disappointed or frustrated that they couldn't get back to play by the next week, or maybe the next week. And now the research that came out of Zemek's work out of Canada in 2016 says 70% of kids get better in 28 days. That is a better place to start with our kids. This is going to be roughly a month. I know that's disappointing for some kids. There are some kids that will recover in a week. That's why it's individualized. But somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks up to a month is important for them to have that mindset so that they are compliant with us with the treatment components. For adults, it's a little bit shorter, 10 to 14 days, but that's still different than what it was in the old guidelines. So 2 weeks to 4 weeks, we're talking about typical recovery. And now, if you are not recovering in that typical amount of time, we would then say some controlled sub-symptom threshold or some maximal exercise has now been helpful. So again, it goes back to that cardio, some aerobic. We're going to get you moving sooner rather than later. And that means that not only with physical, but also cognitively. So a collaborative approach needs to happen where there's controlled cognitive stress so that they understand, then they're not over pushing this. There might be some pharmacological treatment, although later in Berlin they're not really pushing too much of pharmacology, and school accommodations. So again, now this brings in the school academic piece of REAP. We used to, and this is I think the hard part for many clinics, is it's hard for clinics to have somebody on site, school psychologist, or somebody coordinating with schools right away. Not 4 weeks down the road when you're not better, not 8 weeks down the road when you're not better, maybe going to neuropsych testing if you have that option here, but really immediate and flexible academic adjustments to prevent a delay in supports for kids at school. That piece of it should be happening earlier on if possible. So now that brings in that piece. Excuse me. If they're not getting better in a certain amount of time, and usually that's 10 days, 4 weeks, then we start talking about treatment. Treatment is different than management. Excuse me, sorry.
It's the corn.
We haven't even had corn yet. I'll just let you read the slide for a minute. Thank you. Do we have a doctor in the house? Excuse me. So the new part with Berlin is now the recognition and the appreciation that not everybody gets better in a certain amount of time. And if you're not better in the typical amount of time that research is saying you should be, we're going to refer you on for treatment. We're going to refer you on for rehab. Now, many of us in clinics would prefer that we don't wait 4 weeks before we get that referral. We'd like to see the kids sooner and start working on some rehab, usually physical therapy, occupational therapy, if possible. But many of us specialty clinics, we're not getting the kids, and at least in my clinic, we're not getting the kids. 40% of the kids, by the time they come to us, are already 4 weeks out. Consider protracted recovery. So we're not getting them on the front end of a concussion. But when we get them now, we have treatment. So one thing that I always talk about in the clinic is there is a difference between management and treatment. Management is REAP. It's all the things we do in the beginning of a concussion, hopefully to prevent needing to go to treatment. But we do have treatment now. And with treatment, again, there's that exercise program. There's that cardio program. And not only with cardio, but they start to talk about autonomic instability. Those are the kids who have the heart rate changes when they move from laying down to standing up. Those are the kids that are dizzy. And you can actually see that in the clinic. And there's this whole process too. If you keep a kid down for too long, you've got deconditioning. So if you have kids that are feeling very dizzy when they're moving positions, their eyes and all of that are stimulating a lot of dizziness from perhaps deconditioning, then physical therapy, occupational therapy can be very helpful for them. Cervical spine, vestibular dysfunction, that's the vestibular therapy that we've been talking about. So again, if you're one of those people that can refer to a clinic, refer earlier on if possible, because maybe we can start working on this. And again, a collaborative approach with cognitive behavior therapy. What we are now appreciating is that the amount of education that we give to these families and kids, sometimes we scare them. Sometimes we're telling them, you're pretty sick. And that's why the analogy of, you're not broken, you're temporarily inefficient, you're an iPhone 4, but in a week or two you're going to be an iPhone 5. And you're going to see that this is going to get better. But it takes time and it takes rehab. So there's this component now of psychological treatment that we really didn't pay a lot of attention to in the beginning, other international guidelines. And so physical therapy or occupational therapy, basically rehab therapy and psychological, are hugely talked about in the Berlin guidelines, and that's very helpful because there's a lot that I do as a psychologist in terms of kids or families that are overthinking this, over-focused on symptoms, or refusing to acknowledge symptoms. And so it's somewhere in between, and kind of making sure we stop that before it gets too far down the road. There's not a lot of evidence about pharmacology. There's not a lot of use of medications early on, again, because we're going to get better in a month or so, and it's very much a rehab process. So we hope not to jump to that too quickly. The things that tend to really hold up our recovery, the Berlin guidelines have talked about accumulating literature that many of our high school and college kids will take longer than what we used to believe that they would take. Those are primarily from the vestibular issues, the oculomotor issues, the convergence insufficiency, the depth perception, cervical strain, which often leads to headaches, and that autonomic instability. And there's a growing body of evidence about the significance of psychological factors that are either helping our kids to get better faster or delaying because of the component, what they bring to the concussion. So again, with those, you need to have the lens of school, because there are kids who were avoiding school to begin with, and now with this concussion, that heightens it. There are kids in September, October is usually when I see this, a kid who doesn't make a really good transition into high school. It was kind of a tough transition. They're kind of an awkward kid anyways. They get a concussion in September, and we have this problem of getting them comfortable and back into school through the whole year. That's less about the concussion and more about, I just didn't really land very smoothly to begin with, and now I've been out, this is really hard to do because everybody has kind of passed me by. So there are all these psychological factors that you want somebody who really knows about school avoidance, secondary gain, anxiety, depression. 25% of our kids have anxiety without a concussion. So think about how that, again, gets exacerbated. And what a concussion will do is amplify. It is a great amplifier. It doesn't necessarily cause the anxiety as much as if it's an energy crisis and you were already a little bit prone to anxiety before, it's going to heighten that. If you were prone to attentional issues before, it's going to heighten that because you're basically running on empty and you don't have the reserves that you normally would have. So you see everything heightened with a concussion. So again, there's the school academic team. And so where does the family fall with all of this in terms of what do the Berlin guidelines mean then for the family piece of it? Well, like I said, it's important for families and for us as a community to be talking about basically a 4-week recovery and a rehab recovery. You saw earlier the return to school steps that were presented in the Berlin guidelines. Return to school, in my opinion, means your butt in a seat at school when you actually go back to school. That's often not made by an MD. I mean, unless the MD is at your house every morning deciding whether or not on day 4 or day 5 you feel well enough to go to school, there's a lot more education we need to do to parents about return to school, which is the physical getting your body back at school. Return to learn is what do we need our educators to know to help these kids be supported and managed at school. They can't go home every time they have a symptom. We don't want them out for 4 weeks. So what can our educators do to slightly dial down the demands for a week or 2, start to add it back in again, how to, challenge our kids so they don't get too far behind. So return to learn is what we need to do. The empowerment we need to make to our educators. Return to school is what we need to educate our parents. So those components are things that are finally mentioned in the Berlin guidelines, and it's a great place to start, but now we need to do a lot more education behind it. So, so with the return to learn piece of it, many states have moved forward with legislation for return to learn. What we're finding with that is that's fine, that's great, it puts it on people's radar. But in terms of really, what do you teach the teachers? You still have to backfill with the language of the educators so they know what to do. And so the website, GetSchooledOnConcussions.com, is a website for teachers, by teachers, for educators, and it is the language of the educators. So that just gives you an example of one other way that you would be teaching to each one of these groups. This gives you just some examples of what the Get Schooled website shows or teaches teachers. Again, it kind of takes the language of concussion, which is a scary medical thing, but to a teacher, primarily, what's the biggest issue? It is running out of energy, so it's mental fatigue. So, short little breaks at school. Here are some actual interventions you can do if they have ocular motor issues, if they have the autonomic instability. Let them drink more water, let them pass quietly in the hallway. So this is how you take concussion and you make it work for the educators so that they can support the majority of kids without necessarily having to have or wait for doctor input if there isn't going to be a doctor available. And they can be more flexible with their interventions. So for educators, it affects them primarily with academic adjustments. It affects their processing speed. So here are some ideas of what teachers can do. Even if they're not an expert in concussion, slow processing speed, whether it's from ADHD, whether it's from learning disabilities, cut back their work, do every other problem. That's an intervention. Be very helpful for a kid with a concussion and any other kid with slow processing speed. So that's how you take the language of the educator and make it fit for them, and it will help the kid with a concussion. So that would be kind of an example of that. And then how do you adjust the difficulty they have with memory and learning new material, which of course is the whole purpose of being in school, is to learn new material, show that by tests, show that by grades. Well, can you be thoughtful about what you're teaching? Can you do a test in a different way? Can you do an oral presentation? Is a final absolutely necessary? So these, again, are things that educators can adjust to their language. All of this is on the GetSchooledOnConcussions.com website. It's free, it's downloadable, and again, there can be more trainings for this. Same kinds of things for PTs. They have specific trainings they need about how to actually provoke the vestibular oculomotor issues, how to look for autonomic instability, all those things. So you can see how all these teams begin. It's all important that they work together. They're interdependent upon each other. The family and the student piece, while it doesn't get as much recognition when we talk about the Berlin guidelines and all, it is absolutely essential. Because you can tell from here, this is a rehab model. These are all the different specialty groups that work with concussion. But nobody fixes the concussion, really, except for the student, him or herself. They have to follow the management protocol. They have to go to physical therapy or occupational therapy. They have to advocate with their teachers. They have to check their thoughts and not scare themselves by thinking they have a brain tumor. They have to increase their water and their salt intake just for the autonomic instability. There are so many parts of this rehab model that make a kid better over a certain amount of time. And if they blow past all of this and they stay out all night and keep up with their social activities, they're not going to get better. So getting their buy-in and their trust is hugely important from the family and from the student piece. So everybody does have a part. And no one team is more important than any other team. They're all equally important, even though there may be one team that has clearance privileges. That person, that team, can't clear unless all of the rest of this comes together. So let's try and apply this then to a case. Oops. And see how this all works when you actually put it into effect and see how the teams work together. So this is a case of JP, 15-year-old rugby player who was forced backwards and had sustained a concussion by basically head to knee, which is what we're talking about with soccer, the most common thing you tend to see. He felt out of it, headachy, fatigued, trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating, all the things that we now recognize as a concussion, right? He was diagnosed by his PCP at day 5. He had stayed out of school up to that point until he could get in to see his PCP. So he missed a total of 7 days of school through this process. He did go back to, well, I'll get to that. He did go back to school before we got to see him. His concussion history, so the concussion modifiers, the things that we are concerned about could be really exacerbating a concussion, would be history of past concussions, learning disabilities, ADHD, that kind of thing. So he does have some risk factors. He had a number of concussions before this one, and he had some attentional issues that were never diagnosed, but his mom would say she's always been concerned and she always thought she needed to have that looked at, but never did get that looked at. So that's going to be something that we have to watch for exacerbation, right? His third concussion was really a bad one. It resulted in kind of a pattern of migraines, which might have developed anyways, but we'll never know now, right? So when we see him at about 2.5 weeks in, simply because his PCP refers him to us as a specialty clinic. And he has slow to resolve symptoms, which you would expect on concussion number 4. And just the number of concussions was kind of concerning the PCP. And this is what I was saying. About 44% of our kids don't come to us until they're almost at the end or kind of further down the road with their recovery. And so we miss that front end of many of them. His heart rate, we have the autonomic instability. When we test their heart rate laying down, 1 minute sitting up, standing up, and 3 minutes standing up, and if their heart rate continues to rise through that time and they have symptoms of dizziness, their body is just not maintaining their fluid well enough, and we'll recommend things like an increase in salt and water and just for some of those symptoms. He has some slips with his horizontal and diagonal saccades, but not on his vertical. His convergence is 16 centimeters out. We would expect only about 6 centimeters, so he's way far out. He's kind of like us with reading glasses. He's pulling his paper forward. And he has a little bit of balance problem, especially on tandem, where he is having to balance with one leg. His impact scores, and we did not have baseline on him. It's great if you guys are doing baseline here. The majority of the kids that I see in the clinic, we never have baselines on because our schools just have not really done that. I only have one large school district that does that in Colorado. So you can see his baseline, so you can see his post-concussion scores are a little bit low, but we don't have baseline. 50% is average, 25 to 75% is an average range, so you can kind of see where he then falls. Verbal memory of 56 and visual memory of 67%. Those are not too impacted, but visual motor speed, which is the efficiency of your processing, of 4%, and reaction time, do this when it's red but not when it's green, a 2%. We base driving privileges on reaction time and processing speed. Kind of important there to do it when it's red and not when it's green. Both of those are a little bit low, but at baseline I tend to see those to be a little bit low anyways with kids with attentional issues, whether they're diagnosed or not. And in this case, mom says she always thought he had some, but they were never diagnosed. So that's going to complicate that. So what are our treatment recommendations? Education, we do a lot of education to the parents, to the student, to get them to buy into the rehab model, because we're going to require this 15-year-old to do many things he doesn't want to do. But we're not going to restrict him completely. So we do a lot of education. We do supplements, fish oils, magnesium, B2. We watch for the exacerbation of migraines, because I'm worried that that's going to be with the limited, with kind of the compromised cellular issues going on there. The migraines might flare, and sometimes you get an exacerbation of migraines when you have the concussion, and an amplification of those attentional issues. So whatever is weaker, it's going to hit you where you're weakest, basically, with a concussion. So you might see those attentional issues flare. We start the vestibular physical therapy. In our clinic, we only have PTs, so no offense to my OT and speech language friends in the room. We just have our physical therapists do both the ocular motor as well as the vestibular physical therapy, balance therapy. They do the manual neck therapy, all of it. So we start the vestibular therapy, which can be once or twice a week, as well as home cardio. So it's a lot we're asking of this kid. Increase the water and the salt is what you do for the autonomic instability. Ask them to avoid caffeine, and you do a home cardio program, just keeping a small amount of physical activity going. But we don't ever ask that to be done at school or in a PE class or anything like that. In terms of the academic accommodations, it's always standard in our clinic, because I am a school psychologist as well as a clinical psychologist, to always call the school every time I see the kids. So on the initial evaluation, I call the school, I talk to them about what might need to be done. Luckily, for so many of the kids around our clinic, they have heard from me so many times, I've done so many trainings to them, that they already know what to do. Because I didn't really get to see JP until he was about 3 weeks in. And this school had received him back really into that second week. So they had already put into place a lot of what I would suggest that they do, just the basic things, which is the beauty of doing REAP and trainings wider than, try to get that, it'll take a time, but get that training farther out. So they basically had already put into place what he needed to help with symptom management, those breaks, cutting down the work slightly. But really this was so close to the end of the school year with finals that became the biggest issue. So what we really had to talk about was, what do we do about finals? We froze a couple of grades, which is fair. He wanted to take an exam or two because he needed to increase his grades there, but that's fine. If we freeze a couple of grades and we take the electives off, then he has enough energy to focus just on those 2 classes that he wanted to study for and get better grades. So it's not that he doesn't take any, that we don't do any cognitive work, or he doesn't take any finals at all. It's just limited energy. Where is it going to go? We have to prioritize. So this is how we ended up finishing off the year in terms of his academics. In terms of his physical rehab, he started in our PACER program, which is, like I said, an acute concussion rehab program. So we don't necessarily just wait till they're further down the road. He was seen once the 3rd week when we could get him in, and then after that he was able to tolerate 2 times a week for a couple of weeks in there. And we did the Buffalo Concussion Treadmill test, which is also new in the research about how much you can exert somebody in a clinic and how their symptoms are provoked. Helps you know whether this is concussion related versus exercise related, deconditioning and all of that. So our PT did a little bit of that with him at week 8 to see if we were getting provocation with exertion. Did the PT program at home, not only the cardio but also the ocular motor exercises, which I always warn my kids are never the funnest things to do, but it's just like any PT. Might hurt at the time, but it makes you better down the road, but you have to do them. He didn't need anything with his neck. He didn't need any manual therapy, dry needling. And then because our PT's on site with our clinic, we have a lot of communication. So we knew what was going on in PT, we knew how he was responding, and we knew how he was doing at school, so we were able to kind of pull that all together. He resolved when we saw him back at 8 weeks, 90% resolved. He did not kick into a migraine pattern, luckily, but he did have some intentional issues, but really we didn't really focus on that because we're just trying to get him through finals. And now that would be a different issue if that were January, but at the end of the year, that was not what we needed to focus on. And that's why you need someone really working with you with schools, because it's a different intervention depending on the time of the year, too. His heart rate was more stabilized without symptoms of dizziness, and his balance was much better. His saccades were normal. His convergence came into 8 centimeters. His impact scores were improved. You can see how those have improved. His visual motor speed still lower than the others. His reaction time was lower, and so that's when I pull out a little bit of extra testing, which takes me another 5 minutes to do. And so I did the Stroop Test, which is kind of looks at reaction time as well, kind of 46%. So while those 2 areas are lower than his other areas, that might be his baseline if he has baseline attentional issues. We'll never know, but this was good enough. We usually require teacher feedback. So in the back of your REAP form, or REAP booklet, there is teacher feedback that I require all my students to go get from their teachers that tells me, is this kid ready to clear? They are motivated to do that because they want to go back to their activities, and that way they can have that communication with their teachers. Finals is a hard time to do that, but so we didn't really have that because it was really now at this point getting close to finals in summer. But that's another component that you can always add to get some extra data. And so when you look at the form in there on your REAP protocol, do we have all the criteria that we need for clearance? Well, it's when the kid is 100% symptom-free at home. Well, we had parents reporting that he was back to all his home activities, so that's the, don't keep him restricted for too long. Let him do something so that we can figure out if it's provoking symptoms. In terms of the cognitive recovery, we usually have teacher feedback. That's harder to get at this time of the year. We also had neurocognitive testing, and you can see how that works then with the baseline report of ADHD or attentional issues. So we had enough there to say, yes, he's back. We had input from our vestibular physical therapy. Sorry, that's hard to see. We had the Buffalo concussion treadmill test. And we also had the work that they were doing in physical therapy saying he was back to normal. His medical exam was back to normal. And he's off all over-the-counter medications for symptoms of concussion. All of this coming together at that point meant that we could start the graduated return to play. We have an athletic trainer in our clinic who then gives the graduated return to play over to the athletic trainers at the school in the summer. You don't necessarily always have that at this school. We did have one who was around. She wanted to take him through the graduated return to play, and we always love that if there's an athletic trainer around. But you know, there's only about 42% across the nation where we have athletic trainers, so there are some schools where we don't have that. So our athletic trainer coordinates, communicates with the school athletic trainer. School athletic trainer takes JP through the steps because then she can really fine-tune it to what she wants him to go back to. He's not going back to rugby, he's going back to track because this is concussion number 4 and the family's decided we don't want to take this risk anymore. So she puts him through the graduated return to play, she communicates with our athletic trainer, and we make the final clearance. So this is how you kind of see how each one of our disciplines is working with the outside disciplines. So the question is, if you're a specialty clinic, can you do a REAP model in your clinic? Yes, you probably can. The harder question is, can you do the REAP model in your state? Which is, of course, for sustainability, a much better place to go to ultimately in the end. But it takes time, and it's hard to do. But if you look at your Brain Injury Alliance promoting trainings for your medical professionals about all of this, and you're in each one of those disciplines, your healthcare providers doing their own CME trainings for PTs, for OTs, for speech language, they're all speaking the same language, then you're going to get all of these people on board. For your school-based athletic trainers, do you have your state athletic and activities association involved? And you guys do. So there again, you have a lot of education that you can push out to the community so that these kids are taken care of, even if they're 200 miles away from a specialty clinic, they're going to get a lot more support. In terms of your public health and Department of Education, you have them on board. Think about the amount of support that those communities can provide for kids, even if we don't have a specialty clinic, with just some trainings there. And then in terms of your Department of Ed, the academic piece, getting out to the educators, getting them to be able to receive these kids back before they've ever seen a doctor, in case they choose not to see a doctor, because some families choose not to. My school nurses are telling me it's about 40% of kids that are choosing not to ever see a doctor, because they don't fall under our legislation and they don't have to. What are we going to do with those kids? As educators, we take care of all of them. So your Department of Ed can do a lot of training out there to support these kids coming back. And now you have a REAP model not only in small specialty clinics, which is great, you're also having it across your state, which is great for all of the kids that are going to be that 70% that never actually need to go to a specialty clinic or live too far away from a specialty clinic. So this is kind of how you can kind of move this across your state. using the new guidelines. Now, everything we've talked about with the Berlin guidelines, we will incorporate into your Iowa version of your REAP so that, you know, that they will have access to the newest things with physical therapy, rehab, all of that. Okay. Now, there is, if 70% get better in a month, 30% do not. And what does that mean for these kids who have protracted recovery? Well, we don't really know yet. We hypothesize that about some percentage, I don't know what percentage, so I just did 10, 10, 10, some percentage of kids have ongoing concussion-originated symptoms. They never had headaches before, they now have headaches still in the context of the concussion. They never had dysautonomia before, they do now. And if they have these ongoing issues, and they're that small percentage that does, then they need continued rehab in order, and they need more time to get better. So those are the kids that are probably going to need to drive to your specialty clinics and get that ongoing support. There's a certain percentage of kids that we call concussion exacerbators. They had anxiety before and it amplified. They had headaches before and it amplified. The energy crisis that is a concussion has now caused this to flare. It's like sparking a fire. And now we're tamping down both. So maybe we're going to need a combination of a little bit more psych input, psych intervention, as well as concussion. We need more input from neurology, we need more from cardiology, until we can get all of that to settle down. So those are the exacerbated. And there's a certain percentage of kids that we used to call Malingerers. We like to call them misattribution of symptoms now. Sounds nicer. The misattribution of symptoms are those kids who we have overtrained to worry about symptoms. Every little, you know, tweak in their toe hurts. Oh my gosh, I must not be better. Or maybe there is some school avoidance that was there before that now they're using it. Maybe you have some parents who are quite anxious, and so therefore they're seeing everything as something to concern, and they don't want this kid to clear. So in these cases, you're going to need your specialty clinics. You're going to need all your teams working together because it's really hard to figure out. And just in the nick of time, we'll wrap up. So, concussion management, REAP, it's not hard, but it's very complicated because there's so many moving parts. And it requires a concerted effort to collaborate and communicate. But I would have to say Iowa is probably the state that is doing it best. And so anything I can do to support you guys to move forward, I will be here, and we'll take any questions.
So I'm going to be bold and give Karen's voice a break. And what could we, could you hold your questions, because Karen is keynoting right after lunch. The wait staff out in the central area are ready.